All right, wonderful. Welcome everybody to the Equity Minded Competence in the Math Classroom webinar put on by the Center for Urban Education. In case you're curious, the Center for Urban Education, what we do, we create tools that enable practitioners and institutions to bring about equity for racial and ethnic populations who have been historically minoritized. Our theory of change is based on the belief that faculty, staff, and leaders want to do the good for students, but that doing the good to achieve racial equity requires an understanding of how inequality is produced in commonplace policies, practices, language, and dismantling inequality requires new knowledge as well as self-conscious examination of how we can use the power inherent in our positions to change the practices that undermine equity. We have great faith, the Center for Urban Education, that the cumulative effect of small equity-focused actions can have a big impact. So, next slide. We know who the Center for Urban Education is, but who am I? I am Debbie Hansen. I am a senior project specialist with the Center for Urban Education. And with me also leading this session is James Gray, who is currently a project specialist at the Center for Urban Education, but he is on sabbatical, and most of the time he is a math faculty member at the Community College of Aurora. So what are we doing and why are we holding this webinar? It's because we want to tell you about a project we're currently engaged in that is funded by the Teagle Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And what our project is setting out to do is to apply the equity scorecard process, which is really a series of tools and self-reflection processes that I'll tell you a little bit more in a moment. And it's focused on bringing together 3 community colleges in Colorado to engage in this process collectively. Another part of the project is to share what we're doing to all Colorado Community College system colleges. And so we are very glad to have you joining us today because that's a big part of our mission, is sharing what we're doing. And a third component is to develop campus leadership on all levels, faculty, staff, administrators, for them to be leaders on issues of equity. So what does the equity scorecard process look like? Well, it's bringing together faculty and us, representatives from CUE, to participate in action research. So really what we're doing is we're becoming researchers looking at our own practices and the impact of those practices for racialized minority populations. So some of the things we've been doing in this inquiry research approach is looking at course level data disaggregated by race and ethnicity. Each instructor gets their disaggregated data, and they're looking to see which racial ethnic groups are being well served or perhaps not as well served in their classrooms, and that looks very different from one instructor to the next sometimes. We're also mapping out our course practices. What do we do and why do we do it? What is informing our decisions to do what we do? And are there opportunities in which it would be worthwhile to rethink some of those structures? We're looking at classroom artifacts like syllabi and asking what messages are those syllabi sharing, and we're doing class observations to see, for example, who's engaged in class, who does the instructor call on, and so on. And born out of these inquiry strategies are often new practices that our partners will be exploring in the spring. All right, so we're well underway with the welcome part of our webinar. What we'll be doing next is defining equity, and then we'll talk more about what that actually looks like to look at data disaggregated by race and ethnicity. We'll leave about 10 minutes at the end for questions, and then we'll conclude in an hour. These times are off, so please adjust these. And if you would like to ask a question, if you scroll down to the bottom of your screen using your mouse, you will see a little file icon that says Q&A. If you click on that, you'll be able to type in a question. I'll be paying attention to those, and at the end, I'll be able to share your questions to James as well as our panel of faculty partners who I'll be introducing in just a moment. Before I introduce our Community College of Colorado partners, I'd like to share some of the experts that are guiding this work. Dr. Estella Ben-Simone, who is the director of our research center and a professor of higher education at the University of Southern California. We also are very lucky to be working with Lindsay Malcolm-Puku, who's Associate Director for Research and Policy at the Center for Urban Education, and our prior director of our center, who's now moved to Penn State, Alicia Dowd, who's still a part of this project. So our partner campuses include the Community College of Denver, Front Range Community College, and Ames Community College, and we have teams of 5 faculty at each of these colleges working with us to do the work that we've described just previously. And today we are very lucky to have some of the faculty team members joining us to really say what it's like engaging in this work and some of the things that they've been thinking about and doing so far. We have Linda Sue Hoops here from the Community College of Denver. We have Christine Mack from Front Range Community College, and Rita Quintana from Front Range Community College as well.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. And with that, I'll just do a quick introduction to the kinds of things the participants have been doing, what they've been asked to do. And I think I'll just leave it at this. Oftentimes when we take a look at whether students are or are not successful in our courses, we often take a look at the characteristics of the students. And the work for the Center for Urban Education and the work that the faculty participants have been asked to do is actually to take a look at themselves and see what might be happening in their classes and what ways they might be able to influence students doing well in their classes. And the Center for Urban Education does that specific to race and ethnicity. So the faculty partners have been looking at their own data broken down by race and ethnicity to see how their different groups of students are doing. And so with that, we're going to turn to the faculty participants, but first we want to show a quick video. And this is a video that some of you may have seen, but we're going to use it as an introduction to this idea of defining what equity is.
For a $100 bill, the winner of this race will take this. A $100 bill. Before I say go, I'm going to make a couple statements. If those statements apply to you, I want you to take 2 steps forward. If those statements don't apply to you, I want you to stay right where you're at. Take 2 steps forward if both of your parents are still married. Take 2 steps forward if you grew up with a father figure in the home. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a private education. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a free tutor growing up. Take 2 steps forward if you've never had to worry about your cell phone being shut off. Take 2 steps forward if you've never had to help mom or dad with the bills. Take 2 steps forward if it wasn't because of your athletic ability, you don't have to pay for college. Take 2 steps forward if you never wondered where your next meal was going to come from. I want you guys up here in the front just to turn around and look. Every statement I've made has nothing to do with anything any of you have done. Has nothing to do with decisions you've made. Everything I have said has nothing to do with what you've done. We all know these people up here have a better opportunity to win this $100. Does that mean these people back here can't race? No. We would be foolish to not realize we've been given more opportunity. We don't want to recognize that we've been given a head start. But the reality is we have. Now, there's no excuse. They still got to run their race. You still got to run your race. But whoever wins this $100, I think it'd be extremely foolish of you not to utilize that and learn more about somebody else's story. Because the reality is, if this was a fair race and everybody was back on that line, I guarantee you some of these black dudes would smoke all of you. And it's only because you have this big of a head start that you're possibly going to win this race called life. That is a picture of life, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, so with that, we'll go ahead and turn to Christine Mack to share her thoughts. And the question is about defining equity, and how would you define equity to a colleague?
Great, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? We're good? Okay. So I part of one of the things we were asked to kind of write about and think about was defining equity and more of how would you explain it to somebody. And I thought the video was really helpful because it gave a very visual way of seeing, you know, the privileges that some folks get over others. And it also kind of comes at this idea that, you know, though we're looking at race and ethnicity, that there are other factors involved. So a lot of the things they were bringing up were, you know, maybe socioeconomic or you know, cultural kind of thing. However, when you look at the outcome of it, then you saw that it was mostly the white folks who ended up in the front. And that, so I think that kind of played to two different things. First seeing it, and then second looking at the race piece. Because I know a lot of people, it's uncomfortable to think about race. So I thought that could be helpful if I was going to explain to someone what equity means. And then also, when I think about equity, I just think about our students coming to us with different levels of preparation and having a little bit of experience teaching in high schools in our area and seeing kind of differences at those schools, and then thinking bigger picture about where our students have come from. I just know that they're coming from very different places, and they get here and we give them a, you know, placement test or something and expect them to fit into our mold a lot. So I know that equity is not that forcing people to fit into our ideas, it's more giving them what they need for them to be successful regardless of what they came here with. So that's really what I think about and what I would talk to someone about equity.
Okay, thank you, Christine. Rita, how about you?
So when I was given this prompt and I was thinking about it, the first thing I did was to just Google equity and try to get a little help. And one of the things that I came across was equity is the process and equality is the outcome. And that kind of stuck with me. So then I was thinking a little bit more, and I wanted to, the first thing I want to say is that I'm not equating teaching with parenting, but thinking about equity, my mind went to parenting. So as parents, my spouse and I have talked about outcomes for our children. And just like as a math teacher, I have outcomes for my students. So I was kind of seeing a parallel there. You know, I want my children to be moral. I want them to be contributing, self-sufficient, world-aware, inclusive, curious, things like that. And as a math teacher, I want them to be able to reason abstractly, use precise language, apply their math to solve problems, some of the math outcomes. So I really kind of saw a parallel between parenting outcomes and math teacher outcomes. So my children all have different needs, and they have different needs at different times. And sometimes the needs are so significant that, you know, I have to shut some down to really pay attention to the one with the needs. You know, I might have one who has speech problems, one with a broken leg, one who, you know, gets an illness. And so at the end of the day, the attention that I pay to my children is different depending on their circumstances, their personal circumstances. And I think that's how it is with students. The attention that I pay to students varies depending on their circumstances. The supports that I set up vary depending on their circumstances. So that's kind of my take on defining equity. It's a process, and at the end, I want them all to come out equal. I hope that explains it. I have a hard time putting my thoughts into words.
Well, I think in some sense what you're describing is one of the tenets of Q, which is paying attention to the outcomes, and not necessarily, well, not to say not necessarily, but the inputs the outputs are just important as the inputs. Linda Sue, were you ever able to get your microphone working? So just to let everybody know, I did get an email from Linda Sue, and I'm not able to reply to it during this. We're trying to get that worked out, that she can get her voice on this. Linda Sue? Okay, so I think Debbie will continue working with that to try to get her going on that. But we'll go ahead and move forward for the moment. And speaking of the difference between diversity and equity, and why we focus on equity. So diversity is very much focused on emphasis on access to an institution and representation within the student body. That's one way of defining it. And another way of defining it is about valuing difference and providing equal treatment to everyone. And so our director, Estelle Ben-Simon, has said many times that when she would go out and visit colleges, those colleges are very proud of their diversity. And at the Community College of Aurora, we were very proud of our diversity as well. But many of those colleges, and Aurora included, never really thought to take a look at who was graduating and whether or not the graduating proportions of students graduating was the same as those who were entering the institution. And so equity, we like to think of equity as pushing diversity further, taking it to the next level. So equity we define in terms of being race conscious, of being aware of how race and ethnicity can affect the opportunities available to individuals, but also placing an emphasis on parity and educational outcomes. And so those educational outcomes could be many different things. So we can measure graduation rates, we can measure transfer rates, we can measure completion of college level mathematics courses. The participants in this group are actually studying the outcomes based on their own course success rates. And other ways we've done it in the past is to take a look at the success rates of students when they go on to subsequent math courses, or maybe science or business courses that have mathematics as a prerequisite for it. So this is a visual of what we're talking about. So we have the entering student population, and if that student population was 32% Latinx students, for example, we would expect that roughly 32% of the graduating population would be Latinx as well. And the kind of cognitive frames, the way we think about this, the way we frame equity, the cognitive frames are really just a mental map of attitudes and beliefs that a person maintains to make sense of the world. And so what I referred to earlier, that when students aren't successful, we often take a look at their characteristics that lead to that. A different frame is to be able to take a look at ourselves. So what determines, cognitive frames determine, is they determine what questions are asked. As an example, is it something that I'm doing versus is it something the students are doing? It determines the kind of information that's collected. what is noticed, how problems are defined, and what courses of action should be taken. So I'll give you some examples of how I think it's common that we think about things. So I think it's actually common that we have competing ways that we think about things. So one way that we think about things is we think about students, they lack preparation, they lack critical thinking skills, study skills, and oftentimes think about it in terms of grit or growth mindset as well. And we also think about students in terms of the successes that they do have. So we've all had students who have overcome obstacles to be successful. We've all had students who walked into our classes who we thought probably weren't all that prepared, and yet they were able to overcome that as an obstacle. Students have thanked me for being the first teacher who taught in a way that they understood. So that's another experience that we have. So in addition to having this sort of mindset of students may lack preparation, we also have students who have thanked us for the way that we've taught. And the kind of cognitive frame that we hope for is for faculty to accept that how they conduct themselves influences their students, how they see themselves, their sense of belonging, their actions, and their experience within the classroom as well. Another important cognitive frame is this idea of whether mathematics is neutral or not. And it's a very common thing, I think, for both math and science to sort of think of themselves as being neutral classes, colorblind classes. They really don't have much to do with race and ethnicity or other identities as well. But when research is done talking to students, the students do not walk into our classes as neutral beings. They walk in and they are the full sum of the experiences that they've had, and their experience inform how they experience my class. And so if students are experiencing racial discrimination, they're going to bring that into our class. Seemingly race-neutral policies have racial implications as well. And so if we think at the Community College of Aurora, we serve 2 primary school districts. One is predominantly white and one is predominantly non-white. And they teach their mathematics in very different ways. The predominantly white school teaches their mathematics in the very traditional kinds of ways, the sort of the procedural, the rote memorization kinds of ways. And the other school district that is predominantly students of color teaches it in a much more conceptual way. And the impact that that has is when they walk into our classes, the students who come from the more conceptual approach to teaching mathematics walk into classes where the majority of the teachers learn their mathematics and hold a sort of a teaching philosophy that math should be procedural. So already there is a situation in which the way the students think about math and the way the teachers think about math don't line up. And although that's a seemingly race-neutral thing, the fact that the school district that's predominantly students of color are learning their mathematics in a conceptual way means there's a racialized component to that. It does have implications. And I thought this quote, this is a quote that I like: "Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim." And so what we promote at the Center for Urban Education is to be aware of those seemingly race-neutral things that actually have racial implications. And the last cognitive frame, I don't want to lower standards. This is something that no faculty wants to do. And a concern is that being able to address equity gaps within our classes without being able to lower those standards. The cognitive frame that we rather see is faculty saying, I want to raise expectations. And the expectations just don't fall to the students. So it says here, my students can do better, and so can I. So what we're really doing is we're looking to raise our game for our students so they can accomplish more, but we need to expect more out of ourselves as well. And so the next piece of this is to talk about how data disaggregation is used. And in a moment, we're going to hear from the participants what the experience was like for them looking at their own data. And first, I want to just talk very quickly about what data does and what data doesn't tell us. So it's very common when you take a look at the data, and you can see this is the data for me for about 6-7 years worth of Calculus 1 and Calculus 2 data. And I would very much like to ask the data why. Why are Black students experience such a large gap within my class? And that's just not something that data does. And so I might actually start to fill in those things that as students, they don't value education, they're at risk. These are all things that I've heard. They lack persistence, they're underprepared, students are more entitled nowadays, they don't know how to do college. So when we get into conversations as faculty, oftentimes this is the place that we go when we see data, even though the data is not telling us that. Something else is telling us that. Another thing that we would like to do is we would like for the data to tell us what we can do about it. And the data just doesn't do that either. So the kinds of interventions that we've done, co-requisite remediation, study skills, scaffolding, growth mindset, all these different things sort of come about even though the data is not really telling us what it can do, what we can do about it. What the data can tell us that's useful is how we can make it useful. So the first thing that we do is we use the data to tell us who isn't being served within our classes. And you can see that it's primarily Black and Hispanic students who are not being served within my classes. And then the second thing, which is a very important piece of it, is to not just take a look at the gap as a percentage, because it's very abstract that way, but to actually ask the question, how many students will it take to eliminate the equity gap? And so just going through a quick calculation, if I pay attention to the group of students, Black students were the lowest performing in my class, and if I compare that to the overall department average, and it doesn't have to be the department average, it could be an aspirational goal, then I end up with what the percentage point gap is, which is very large, which is very intimidating. But then the thing that we want to do is we want to figure out, well, how many students does that actually translate to? And so we do this calculation, and it turns out to be 8 students. And so immediately, 8 students over a 6 or 7 year period doesn't seem all that intimidating anymore. And more than that, I'm able to take that and divide it by the number of sections taught. So what this is saying is about 0.73 students per class. If they had been successful, there would have been no gap within my class. There would have been a 73.2% success rate for the students in my class. And it's very important that we do something like this, because what it did was it caused us to start taking a look at and thinking about our students as individuals. Rather than thinking about our students and sort of trying to understand what's happening, all of a sudden I could visualize the students in my class. And when I started visualizing the students in my class, I started to just do some inquiry with those particular students and just try to understand how they're experiencing the class. And I could have interventions that were done for specific students rather than thinking about how I can change my entire class to be able to eliminate a 30.9% gap. So the idea is that we take something that's very abstract, frankly, which something is very intimidating, and turn that into something where it's very useful. So with that in mind, we'll turn it back to our faculty participants and just ask the question, because you've all reviewed your own course data disaggregated by race and ethnicity. What would you tell us about the way you experienced that process? Feel free to speak up in any order.
I'll go ahead. Just for consistency. So I was looking at 2 classes in particular. So I teach a Math 050 course, and in that course, how we've structured it at this campus is it's very looking at applications and concepts, and they're working in groups, and so more cooperative and collaborative learning styles. And for that class, when I looked compared to our department average, I found that in I was above department average except for with Native American students. I had 3 students, only 1 passed, so I was 14.6% lower than the department average. And then I was looking at other, each category, and with my Latinx students, I was above, and with the white students above. And what was particularly cool, I thought, was with the Latinx students, it was 17.2% higher than department average. And it was even higher than 8.3% higher was for the white students. So they were even more successful than like the white students in class. I get hesitant to get too excited. That's why I look at the data and I just start asking him a bunch of questions. Like, what's going on here? So I worried a little bit with that by using the department average, that because 050 tends to have higher pass rates, maybe that wasn't the best way. However, I felt pretty good about it, and I think the structure of the class could lead a lot of that success. However, I taught also an 055 class, and it was the numbers were just disheartening and kind of abysmal. So with undeclared students, so students who didn't say what their race or ethnicity was, I was 45.1% lower than average. For 2 or more groups, I was 32.7% lower than average. My Latinx students were 19.2% lower. Where was it? Oh no, white students were 19.2% lower, and then the Latinx were 16.2. So the kind of the feelings associated with that is like, I just felt like I'm doing a disservice. Like, how can I have these groups of students in 2 different classes and have such different outcomes? And when I think about the structure of how I teach 055, it's definitely more procedural and traditional. And like hearing James just now talk about the different districts and where the students are coming from, that's something I was making note, like we should find out where our students are coming from, because that could be really informative too. So perhaps we're having more success because of our teaching style, and and then taking it personally too. It's not necessarily just the structure, because compared to other teachers who teach 055, I'm still not doing as well, in particular with groups of students who were not white. So it's an icky feeling. I don't know how to describe it better. It just feels unsettling, because that's not who I am as a person. Like, I definitely it is, but it's not who I want to be, I guess. And then finally, I looked at 075. So it's this combination. How do you say? It's like a pilot we're trying to do in 6 credits, like 050 and 055 together. We won't be running it anymore, so don't worry. That's something that bothers you. And maybe because our success rate was not very good. So I looked at my grade book for that one. And again, like, my students who are passing were white, and it's more of a just traditional class. And putting names to the students was helpful too, because then if for that current class, looking at the grade book, I can think of, Terrence or whatever, like have a name for the student. I'm like, what is going on with Terrence? Like, why is he not being successful, and what could I do to help him? So I feel like we're starting to get to the point of coming up with some ideas, and right now just still asking a whole lot of questions and try not to let the feelings get in the way. Even though it doesn't feel good, I have hope that it will feel better if we try some things. So that's.
Thank you. And it honestly, it does feel a bit icky when you take a look at your own data, and that's something that I can relate to when I first looked at my data. But at the same time, learning that I can impact that I do have influence over that is definitely an empowering feeling, for sure. So, Rita?
Okay, so this is tricky. I chose, I think I didn't do the assignment quite correct, and I need winter break to really go into my data and look. But I chose one class, and it was a Math 121 class, and I've taught it the most lately, so I had the most data. And so I focused on that class, and the first thing that I noticed is my success rates very much outpaced that of my department. And so right away, I felt defensive. I felt, oh my gosh, I'm too easy. I wanted to hide the data from my department colleagues. I don't even want to go look at how do my students do when they leave me, because I just had all this really horrible feelings. And so why is that? And then I started to think, well, these classes were taught at Brighton Center, so it's a small center, and our demographics are unusual. My classes for college algebra were never more than 20 students. The demographic at the center is young Latina. So my students were young, they were Latina. Their place in the center is a place of leadership. And so some of the demographics are just different. It's a small community. Many of my students have gone to school together since they were in kindergarten. Did that have anything to do with it? So I started thinking about, and at the center, some of the students are in 2 or 3 or 4 classes together every semester. So it's just a real unusual situation. So I just have a lot more to do. I know that when I look at my other courses, the courses that I teach at our main campus, I have gaps. I have gaps in my Math 050 class. I had some gaps with Hispanic student success, actually retention. So I retain fewer students in the Hispanic. So I'm looking at I should say Latino or Latinx, but our college says Hispanic, so I'm looking at that data. So I have a lower retention rate, but then a higher success rate of those that I do retain. In my Math 166 class, I have a gap in my Latino students there. And so I really want to take time. It's a scary thing. But with the support of the department, and I think the non-judgment that we're giving to each other, I think it's very important work. And I want to go look at the grade book, because when I look at my data, I think, who are these students? And I need to go look and see individually who they are. So I knew I would stumble through this part because it's just a tricky thing. But I think it's a worthwhile experience when you get over the fear. I'm still not over the fear, but when you deal with that fear and just look at your data, it's a good thing. It will have a good outcome.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing, Rita. Let me just do a quick check. Did Linda Sue ever able to get her microphone working? Okay, I very much apologize. We very much wanted Linda Sue to be a part of this. We apologize for the technical issues. But maybe that gives us a chance, since we have some time, to be able to ask Rita and Christine. So once we took a look at the data, we also started doing some other inquiries. So we started thinking about how we conduct our classes the first 2 days of the semester, but also the observations as well. So the participants have doing observations of each other classes to be able to try to notice patterns within those classes. And I was wondering if you would be willing to share some of those patterns that you saw. Debbie?
If you wouldn't mind me kind of narrowing that a little bit more, because I think we can give kind of a demonstration of how we use the disaggregated data. We were intentional when talking with Christine and Rita to think about, well, based on what we're seeing in the data, what questions might we ask when we're stepping back and transitioning from this kind of quantitative research to qualitative research? What questions might we ask based on what we're seeing in the data when we're looking at our classroom?
Okay, so prior to the observations, just thinking in general, like what kind of questions might we want to have answers to as a result of our data? Okay, yeah, that's what I want to know. So compared with other teachers, like what are they doing different than I'm doing? Like what do their classes look like, and how are they structuring it? Particularly the ones who are having success with our Latinx students, because I know, especially 055, like I walk by other people's classrooms, I don't get a chance to observe as much as I would like to, but people have it structured very different, and I would like to know about how that works for them. And even just like little things, like how are they interacting with their students? So I tend to be fairly casual. Is that an issue? You know, I feel like there's a whole range of where are they coming from? You know, where are these students coming from, and what have they experienced before? am I giving them more of the same old stuff, and that's why they're not being so successful? I don't know. I feel like I could write like a tome of like what's happening here, because I without, because my actions are, I feel like, with good intentions, but my impact is not how I would hope. So there's certainly a disconnect there.
What about, oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's it.
No, I was going to say, how about you, Rita?
So some of the questions that I ask, how are students engaged? What does engagement look like? I think that's big for me. What am I asking students to do? Do I allow everyone to participate? Do I offer opportunities? I think that's mainly after the class observation. I think I would ask different questions because things came up in the observation. Do you realize that all of your Latino students sit on the right side of the room? What's that all about? I don't know. But they're, students who are very quiet in the like the lecture portion of the class became very differently involved during the small group portion of the class. So I think those are observations that an outsider to my room can make while I'm going about the business of teaching. Yeah.
No, that's really I think both of you are really giving the example of what we mean when we say practitioner inquiry, and James was highlighting that when looking at data. I think our tendency is to start to try to explain it away, but both of you are taking on that inquiry mindset where you're asking questions, which can be uncomfortable because you don't necessarily know the answers yet, but those questions really allow us to get to something meaningful about what's happening in the classroom. And we're a few months into the process, and maybe a year from now, you will be able to say a lot more about what it is we learned as we delved into these questions more. But for the sake of our audience, who I don't want to be left feeling like, what do I do with this? I wonder, James, if you would talk about some of the things that you did in your own classroom following these observation activities and the impact of it.
Absolutely. So before I answer that, I just want to invite, because I'm looking and I don't see any questions coming to the Q&A. And so we're getting to the point where we're reasonably close to the question part of it. So if you do have questions, feel free to go ahead and post into that. And so this is exactly where I was. I was taking a look at my data. I didn't know what to do. And I was fortunate that I observed one of my colleagues. And my colleague was a African-American female. And when I observed her class, I noticed that I think the best way to say it is that she sort of held power. And I don't mean power in a negative sense, but she held power in a different way than I did. And so she was very direct with what she was asking students. She wasn't rude. She wasn't aggressive. She was very direct. This is what I want you to do. And when I saw her doing that, and I saw the reactions of her students, and her students, I could clearly see that they were getting excited, that they were really buying into what she was asking them to do. And the reflection was thinking about myself sort of as, I think I was socialized, that it's not polite to be directive with adults, sort of this don't tread on me kind of thing. I cannot infringe upon the rights of other people to make the choices that they want to do. So when I walked into my classroom, one of the experiments I tried was to ask my students to come to class 15 minutes early. And I got to that point in the PowerPoint slide, and I remember thinking, am I going to do this? Will people actually listen to me? And I just sort of did it. And I just said, this is the expectation. And the next class, the strangest thing happened. The students started coming in early. And so I probably had about 75% of the class in class 15 minutes early. And then you're sort of stuck thinking, well, what do I do now? I've got all these students here, what do I do? But that was a very early lesson for me of influence that the faculty have. Not just in terms of students being willing to listen to what we're asking of them. Students really do want to develop trust with with their teachers. But it also was a lesson in terms of what I don't ask for. I would not ask for things because of sort of how I was socialized. There's definitely a racial component in that as well. And what I learned is that by not asking things, I really am asking for things. So the idea that even if you don't lead, people will still follow. It's just that they may not know what they're following. And so continued experiments were taking a look at my gradebook and taking a look at patterns of attendance, who was coming, who was doing their homework and things like that. And rather than finding out who wasn't doing well during the first test, which might have been a month into the class, I was finding out who wasn't doing their homework, or not even just not doing their homework, but wasn't doing it quite the way that I expected it. And I'll give you an example of that. So being more intentional about talking to students when I saw patterns that I thought were sort of detrimental. And I would go up and I would talk to the students and I asked them, how are you doing your homework? And they would tell me, one particular person in particular, a young black male, ended up telling me that when he goes home and he doesn't know how to do a problem, he'll start to look for videos on YouTube. And so I'll just start asking him about some of those videos. And turns out he was spending 45 minutes or an hour watching videos. And if you've ever looked for videos as a teacher, you know that some of the videos just don't line up with what you're trying to get across. And some kind of go off on tangents that are way different than what you want. So what I realized is that this person who I probably would have assumed isn't doing their homework, or perhaps they don't value education, what I ended up finding out is they do value it quite a bit. They were actually working harder than many of the other students in class who were doing the homework sort of the way I expected. And so, so what I learned was a quick course correction, and just letting them know, you know, this question that you have would literally take just 2 minutes for me to be able to answer, and you just spent an hour watching a video. And so the more and more that I learned, the more that I started to talk to students, the more things that I learned about how they felt about coming into class. Students coming in and telling me about their racialized experience, opening that up to me and telling me how one person in particular, an older Latino, talking about how he was treated in his high school years. He always wanted to study mathematics. He always wanted to do well at it. And yet he was always told that he had to go to the lower level classes. And this is something that he carried around with him for years and years and years. It was part of his identity. So it's a great example of, if I had remained neutral in the class racially, if I said that race had nothing to do with mathematics, I wouldn't have found out that this person's experience with their math teachers was very much informed by racial discrimination. And so just by learning that, just by him opening up and sort of trusting me with that, I was able to reach him in ways, and he ended up being quite successful in the course. And what it meant to him to pass the course was far beyond the meaning for many of the other students in classes, because it was a moment where he could believe more about himself than what the narrative other people were saying about him it might indicate.
I think it might be useful to give kind of an overarching check-in about what it is that the Center for Urban Education in this project is setting out to do. It's intending to couple disaggregated data analysis, reflection on classroom practices, observations of peer classroom practices, and even more importantly, reflecting on beliefs about students, beliefs about your role in the classroom. All of these actions have the potential to make meaningful impact. And James, I think you can then say, well, first, correct anything I got wrong, but second, talk about you have closed gaps in your classroom using these strategies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it took a while for me to get to the point. It's interesting listening to Rita and Christine talk about it, and Rita in particular talking about still having that fear. Even when I experienced less gaps after the first semester of trying this, I didn't quite believe it. I didn't have that sort of self-efficacy that I had something to do with it, that it turned out to be a fluke, turned out to be the students in the class and not to me. I had the great fortune of being the department chair and being able to observe other people, and I could watch patterns that were happening in classes. And so while some may experience, for example, that Latinx students aren't as participatory in some classes, I could walk into classes and I could see that that this was not happening with other teachers. One of our teachers, for example, his highest performing group is Black males. And you know, if I listen to all those things that people tell me about Black males and how they don't care and how they should be feared in some sense, if I listened to that, I couldn't explain why they were so successful with this particular faculty member. So sort of long story short, you get to the point where you really do feel empowered. You feel you have the ability to influence students. And you start to see students in a different way. Rather than seeing students as lacking things when you come in, you start to see students as having absolutely everything they need to be successful. And then through a process of learning how I communicate, how I set expectations, how I hold power, again, power in a positive sense in the class, how I develop the structure in the class. An interesting observation is I had the president of the college was doing observations of faculty, and she came 15 minutes early, and she looked through the window of the class and she didn't want to come in because she thought there was a class that was going on. But it wasn't a class that hadn't ended yet. It was my class. It was my students that were there early, and I was literally just standing up front, and the students were engaged with themselves in the mathematics. And she walked in and she said she'd never seen anything quite like that before. And what that showed me is that when you do this well, when you really get down to understanding what motivates students, when you get down to being able to influence how they view themselves, students will work harder than you. And that's something that a lot of faculty feel is there's frustration that I'm working harder than my students are. There's another way of actually going about it where the students work harder than you do. And again, being at that point is very much an empowering feeling.
Thank you, James. We are very much still welcoming any questions. In the meantime, James, would you mind moving to the last slide so that people can see our contact information?
Yes.
And if you're not quite sure what your question is now, or one comes to you at a later time, we would hope you would email us, WPE@Rossier, that's me, Gray, Jame, that is James, and we would be very happy to engage with any of your questions. While we wait in hope that somebody would share anything that's on their mind, I want to open the table to Rita and Christine if there's something more you want to share or observe as our partners in this project.
I thought it was really cool observing other people's classes. Like I've done it more lately as part of like your course lead, and you have to go make sure that everything's going good with the adjunct in your class. But I got to go watch my colleague Jim in a Calc 2 class, and like it was just neat to see something different. But then also it was really interesting to watch the patterns like of interaction. I thought that was so cool. And then we were able to sit back and talk, and we had a lot of the same patterns of who's participating and who, because the protocol, we were looking for participation in class and who's just like saying stuff and who's are they on their phone, are they watching, like, so we were watching all those details that I can't get on my own in class as easily as someone else coming in. So that was a really cool experience, which led to a lot more questions too, because my Latinx students are now participating at the same race, and it's good stuff to know and to start asking a lot about. But it's just such a neat thing to be on a team of people working on the same thing together with the common goal of helping all our students be successful. It's been really empowering, though scary and kind of unsettling, that we're all doing it together has made it better.
for me, this has made me want to, I always want to have a reset, and that's the beauty of being a teacher. You can reset at the semester breaks, and really thinking about how I structure my class for next semester from, before the students walk in. We were asked to do a mapping of the first 2 days of class. And we were asked to only think about what we ask students to do, what I as a teacher ask of my students. And it's really hard to not think of myself, what I'm doing, but just rather what I'm asking students to do. And through that, I realized that I ask a lot of my students in terms of getting off to a good start. And so thinking about how what I'm asking students to do has real implications on how how they might succeed in the class. So I'm switching things up, the whole electronic component of the class. After the first day, I asked them they need to be on my math lab, they need to be navigating Desire to Learn, they need to be up and running on a lot of things. Email, 2 different sorts of email, external and internal. And I really don't provide support for that. And so I think just this real the real reflection that we've been required to do, required is probably the wrong word, but that we've done as a result of these prompts from the Q people. I'm excited to start again, and with a real kind of scientific look at what I'm doing and what impact does it have.
Well, we are at the end of our webinar, and I am going to perhaps hope that we've been so thorough in our explanations that people haven't needed to pose additional questions. But again, let me reiterate that James and I would love to see your questions and to continue this conversation. I want to give an extra special thanks to Christine Mack and Rita Quintana for joining us today and talking about your experiences partnering with the Center for Urban Education to engage in the equity scorecard process. Also, a special thanks to Linda Sue, and a hope that this hasn't been horribly frustrating, and an apology that we will be sure to be more intentional in the structure we provide for technology on-ramping in the future. So I say thanks, and James, if you want to send us off.
Just a quick thanks to everyone. We will be doing more webinars in the future, and we hope to be able to bring this work to other community colleges in Colorado as well. All right, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.